Welcome back to Acid Horizon. Today we're excited to announce that the enrollment session for fall of 2025 for the Acid Horizon Research Commons is officially live. The Commons is our new para-academic platform, a space for collaborative learning that steps outside the limits of a traditional academic classroom. It's where philosophy, politics, psychoanalysis, art, and much more converge, and where ideas too often pushed to the margins can be studied with depth and urgency. This fall, we are launching our first two courses. Culture critic Grafton Tanner, whom you know from books like Babbling Corpse and The Hours Have Lost Their Clock, will guide us through the politics of nostalgia, exploring memory, media, hauntology, and the commodification of longing. And our friend, researcher Jeremy R. Smith, will lead a course on Francois Laruelle and non-philosophy, introducing us to the radical mode of thought that unsettles philosophy's boundaries and opens new possibilities for theory. And so, fall is almost here. That means it is time to go back to school. And if you have been mulling the possibility of dipping your toe back into rigorous academic study with experts in the field, definitely check out the Acid Horizon Research Commons. All of the relevant links are in the show notes. Today on the show, we have a new friend with us, Fredrik Westerlund, and a friend who is returning, Nicholas de Warren, and we're going to discuss the concept of identity and its relationship to credit and ressentiment. There are a lot of exciting things happening in this discussion, namely the twists and turns it takes through figures in Greek tragedy. So let's check in with Fredrik and Nicholas. Welcome to Acid Horizon, the theory podcast. How do the images we hold of ourselves come into being? And why do they exert such a grip on us? What social forces shape these ideals, the versions of ourselves we hope to become? And what happens when we fall short, or when those ideals drift ever further from reality? In an age where selfhood is often built on credit, how do we sustain belief in an identity that has yet to be realized? And what happens when that belief turns to what we call ressentiment? Today, we are joined by philosopher Fredrik Westerlund, who will guide us through the existential dynamics of identity on credit and its modern companion, ressentiment, a defensive posture towards the world that both frees us from the need for immediate approval and tempts us into self-deception. Fredrik was introduced to us by our good friend Nicholas de Warren, who also joins us for this conversation. And you might remember Nicholas from our earlier episode on the anarchist imaginary from earlier this year. Together, we will explore the modern psyche's double bind, the freedom to imagine a self beyond present constraints, and the burden of measuring ourselves against an ideal that may never arrive. Fredrik, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot, Craig. Very nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me. And good to see you too, Nicholas.
Good to see you as well, Fredrik.
Well, Fredrik, can we talk a little bit about you, this particular research that was presented to me via Nicholas, and then why is it that you decided to take on this particular problem philosophically?
Well, I'm working on a book. I'm writing a book on the existential, let's say, challenges of modernity. It's a kind of broad overview of various troubles, one might say, that arise with modernity that have to do with identity, with recognition, with self-esteem, and so on and so forth. And this topic of identity on credit came up when working on that book. I mean, let me add that my background is very much in moral psychology. So I've been working on shame, recognition, those kinds of themes, and also on themes like self-deception and ressentiment. So maybe it wasn't a pure coincidence that I started to thinking about these different ways in which we kind of postpone things like recognition, when we postpone the realization of our identity, etc., etc. I think that was my path, or some of the background for the path to this topic.
It's an exciting topic for me, one that I'm happy to revisit, and especially in a fresh new context with, I guess you would say, a contemporary twist on the problem. So to kick things off, can you walk us through what you mean by identity on credit? And how is that different from older ways of thinking about who we are?
Yeah, thanks. So my basic proposal is that the onset of modernity gives rise to, or rather amplifies and generalizes, a structure of identity that is characterized by what I call existential credit. And this structure manifests in its most radical form in the attitude of ressentiment. Now, what does this mean? Now, identity, as we all know, is a word with many meanings, which are often confused with each other. And when I talk about identity, I refer to our own conception of who we are and want to be. Thus understood, our identity consists of such things as our values and ideals, our life tasks and commitments, our life narratives and central traits, etc. Now, there is today widespread agreement among philosophers and psychologists that we need recognition, social recognition from others, in order to develop an identity and uphold sound self-esteem. And there is probably some truth to this. However, what has been less attended to is the fact that our identity from the outset tends to be motivated and formed by our drive for recognition. Typically, a crucial part of our identity is presenting ourselves to others and also conceiving ourselves in ways that make us appear socially respectable and attractive. And to a great degree, it is this aspect that makes our identity emotionally charged. It makes us feel that we need to live up to our identity to maintain self-esteem, and it makes us prone to feeling shame and depression when we fail to do so. Why? Well, because we have invested our hope for recognition in our identity, and it seems to us that the ability to be the person we claim to and want to be undercuts our ability to achieve affirmation. So this is the dimension of identity that I want to focus on. Now, in pre-modern times, people's identities were closely tied to their predetermined social roles and how they performed them in public. And they were inclined to view their given social group, such as the extended family or tribe, as something like a community of destiny in which they were bound to live their entire lives. For this reason, the group's judgments were liable to be perceived as an absolute verdict on the social life or death of its members. Each person's social role and the status attached to it were largely predetermined before birth, and the individual's primary task regarding social recognition was to fulfill the requirements of their social role through public deeds. And in this kind of setting, there was little room to fantasize about achieving social success that radically exceeded one's social role and current public achievements. Now, this changes with the advent of modernity, where the socio-economic, technical, and ideological developments that spell the birth of modernity, capitalism, urbanization, globalization, the scientific revolution, and so on, these developments loosen the ties between the individual and her group and open up new possibilities for geographical and social mobility. And so for us living in modernity, no social group represents our definite destiny, and no group has the absolute power to judge our social value. In principle, we can always imagine and choose different collective settings, hoping for appreciation in a future group. And the greater distance between us as individual and every given group then broadens our scope for fantasizing about what we could do and who we could become. Moreover, the new possibilities of social mobility make it easier to dream of freeing ourselves from our current social setting and advancing socially through skill, through hard work, through cunning, through luck, and so on. Now, these changes in sociality make it possible for us to develop a subjective self-ideal alongside our actual public persona. That is, alongside the image that others de facto have of us. And by self-ideal, I mean my idea of who I ideally am before others, It's a picture of myself as socially attractive and valuable. It's my ideal image of myself in terms of my potential to win the approval of others. And what this ideal looks like then, it can vary from person to person. It may include being powerful and rich, sexy and beautiful, intelligent and funny, courageous and loving. It may also include being skilled and talented in various practices. Now, this psychologically, the self-ideal functions as a kind of buffer against my actual performance in the eyes of the group. So although I ultimately hope to be affirmed by others, my self-ideal is not entirely determined by how I actually fare in their judgment. Perhaps my current situation is not ideal. Perhaps I feel disrespected in my social context. Of course, I must believe that sooner or later my self-ideal will become social reality. However, despite de facto disappointments, I might be able to maintain my belief in my ideal self as fundamentally socially attractive. And this all means that humans in modernity tend to live in a kind of existential loan economy, one might say, to the extent that I build my self-esteem in the present on a promise of social success in the future. I'm living my life on credit. I tell myself that I'm actually this kind of person, a person that I will demonstrate publicly in due course and that others will admire. Living on credit means that I base my self-esteem on a promise of a social self that does not yet exist, but that I convince myself I will one day become. And living on this kind of credit, of course, then creates a kind of particular existential and emotional dynamics with its problems and maybe also some possibilities.
Thank you. And I'm glad that we have now the broad strokes of your theory. And I definitely want to get Nicholas in the conversation as well. But I'll just ask one more question before that. I always find it interesting and important when a theorist, a writer, an author, a philosopher includes an example from Greek myth or Greek tragedy as a way to buttress their ideas. And you bring in the figure of Ajax from Greek tragedy. What do you think that particular story shows us about how people's sense of self worked in the past compared to now? And maybe how has some of Ajax's legacy trickled on over into modernity?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. As you said, I use Ajax, the hero in Sophocles' play, as an example. In order to kind of spell out or shed some light on the difference of more ancient identity structures, and then what I call the identity on credit structure. And maybe I should briefly kind of recount the plot of the play for those who are not familiar with it.
Oh, by all means, please do.
So the play unfolds in the aftermath of the death of Achilles, the main hero in the Trojan War. When Achilles is killed, the question arises as to who will be honored with his armor. And Ajax expects to receive it, but the leaders of the Greek army, Agamemnon and Menelaus, give it to Odysseus. Ajax sees this as a great humiliation, of course, and sets out to kill Agamemnon, Menelaus, and Odysseus in revenge. However, the goddess Athena strikes Ajax with madness, making him believe that the cattle in the army camp are his enemies. And in a wild rage, Ajax then massacres a large number of sheep and cattle, as well as some herdsmen. And when he then later realizes what he has done, he is filled with shame at the ridiculous and dishonorable image that he is now kind of bound to exhibit to his father and his entire honor group. And the whole story ends with Ajax taking his own life. Of course, there are complications in the play, and we might want to return to them. But we still, and Ajax is, of course, a hero that's extremely concerned with his honor and his glory. So he is not just any man, as it were. But anyway, his experience here seems to be that this kind of humiliation before his honor group is basically a kind of definitive calamity. At some point in the play, he exclaims, where can I flee? Where can I find peace? And these are rhetorical questions because the answer is in his own mind. Well, he can flee nowhere. He's stuck with this audience that sees him as ridiculous, or so he thinks. So basically, he is kind of, because he has messed up badly before his honor group, he doesn't see any possibilities anymore of comeback, of somehow changing his life course, etc., etc. And this is a kind of situation that we rarely experience in modernity, one might say, or at least it's not the paradigmatic situation that any person finds herself in. So here we might say that we could, or what I do here in the text I sent you is that I kind of made up a kind of fiction about what would happen to Ajax in the modern age. And of course, I made him a student of philosophy. So, you could have the example of a PhD student having worked. This is Ajax's modern twin, having worked on his thesis for ages, believing in it, etc., etc. Then comes the day of the doctoral defense, and the international renowned professors who read it and review it are just completely clear about this being a horrible piece of work. And the modern Ajax now knows that this is the kind of image of himself, spread in academia all around, basically a loser. And of course, we could imagine the modern Ajax humiliated, ridiculed, also taking his life, because, this is a devastating experience after all. But what I'm claiming is that for the modern Ajax, many ways are now open to rescuing himself, exactly because of this structure of identity on credit, because the modern Ajax can think, well, this was bad. This was a really devastating judgment, but there are many social settings where I might still be successful. Maybe there are professors around somewhere in the world who really understand my work, and maybe these guys assessing my thesis, after all, were, fools and prejudiced, idiots, and so on and so forth. So I can tell me all these kinds of stories to kind of save my image of myself as, at bottom, a great philosopher.
Well, I think that's an excellent recasting of the Ajax myth. For one thing, you've made an incredible appeal to pathos, because many of our listeners are graduate students or PhD students who not only suffer things like imposter syndrome, but face the real structural hurdles, especially in the United States and the UK right now, where we're experiencing essentially a de facto defunding of the university, not to mention all of the problems that has layered on to the existing problems that we've had over the past 20 to 35 years in academia. And just to return quickly to the Ajax myth, I find it interesting that from a mythopoetic or even a psychological standpoint, that the thing that triggers Ajax fury, of course, it's a failure to achieve recognition, but what reward was it that he failed to receive? It wasn't a crown, it wasn't a sword, but it was armor, something that defends the person, defends the identity, a kind of cladding. It almost recalls like Wilhelm Reich's concept of character armor in a sense too. And there's also this resonance that we get throughout various Greek tragedies, like I think particularly of Euripides' Bacchae, where Pentheus, in his moment of rage and resentment, suffers a kind of hallucination as well. So there is this fall from grace, or this failure to achieve recognition. And then there's this moment where we are caught up in this hallucination that leads to our demise. In the case of Ajax, his suicide, and then in the case of Pentheus, being torn apart by the Maenads. But I actually want to pull Nicholas into the conversation too.
Yeah, thank you, Craig. So I was curious whether a modern Achilles is possible, because I like the way in which you, Fredrik, used the Ajax story and sort of transposed it into today, that Ajax has more opportunities to find a kind of redemptive community for his shattered ideal and therefore overcome his shame. And I guess not become so much a creature of rage, but rather of resentment. That's how I would read it. But of course, I would say that what's interesting about the Ajax story is that, as Greg just mentioned, the object at stake is the armor of Achilles, the armor in which Achilles' partner Patroclus had died. So there's two layers of complication. I mean, who is the armor? Who is, whose ghost inhabits that armor? Whose aura is in that armor that then that Ajax somehow wants to appropriate for himself? So I guess one would be just to think about the contrast between Ajax and Achilles, because it seems that the rage of Achilles is quite different than the rage of Ajax. I mean, you might say that the whole point of the Iliad is the rage of Achilles is precisely the condition or the context for Achilles to achieve an immortal deed and in his own way have an identity on credit. That identity on credit would be that we are still telling the story and recounting the story of the immortal deeds. So the identity of Achilles, almost in Arendtian sense, is the pursuit of immortality through excellence which is inscribed in narrative. So that would be one way to think there is something like an identity on credit of sorts in the notion of Achilles, and that's his blessedness and cursedness at the same time. And then one would be just to talk about that. And then the follow-up would be, is there another kind of identity on credit before the modern conception that you analyze, which would be the Christian conception, which is precisely providence. My full identity as a person is only constituted in the day of the last judgment before God. So all of my life is about credit. All the deeds that I do, the good deeds and the bad deeds. And when I die, in a sense, I am still living on credit because I have to await the day of days and the final judgment. There, it would seem that we have a different model of an identity on credit. So I would say Achilles and the Greek is one, the pursuit of immortal deeds, almost in the Arendtian sense, the pursuit of excellence in the political space or the public space. The other would be the Christian model. And then this would be sort of the question, how does that sharpen the contrast with your argument, which at base I find convincing, that one of the problems of modernity is, in a sense, the vicissitudes of a certain conception of an identity built on credit, which is different than how it was formulated and handled in the Christian context, and let's call it in the Greek context, also to be very Nietzschean, that these are the three ages of the world, at least of the European/American experiment.
Yeah, well, that was a big bucket of questions. Let's maybe begin with Achilles. I mean, I haven't thought about Achilles in this context, but my spontaneous. I mean, you're right, of course, that Achilles, that one important motivation and is the kind of pursuit of immortal glory. But what makes me think, at least as a kind of first reaction, and you might, of course, still make me change my view on this, but is that in contrast to Christian ressentiment or modern ressentiment, there is a kind of continuity between Achilles' honor in this life and his glory in, let's say, future narratives, in becoming a hero in Homer's Iliad, etc., that we are still recounting and listening to. So it seems to me that there is, or at least I don't see that Achilles would somehow kind of postpone his kind of expectations for honor and glory and recognition, but really that the glory that he would kind of receive in the afterlife is kind of just a big bonus in a certain sense, if to put it a bit crudely, that I achieve all these things in this life. Then, of course, the Greeks didn't have a notion of a great life after death, in the underworld. And instead, they had this idea of living on in the memory of future generations through poetry, through narrative, etc., etc. But it seems to me here that glory is not in the same way a kind of compensation for miseries at the present in the way that it can be in a Christian context or in a modern identity on credit context.
Yeah, well, one point would be, you emphasize in this work in progress that the contrast between, pre-modern conception of the self, which is bound to a closed social universe of recognition. In one sense, it's, kind of the story, and it's an idealized type, as you yourself say, but it's kind of the story that, Georg Simmel, Scheler, they'll have this conception of the pre-modern as a closed place. Everyone has fixed identity. It's not malleable, et cetera, et cetera. And that above all, the important thing is the social recognition, and that on this argument, individuals in the pre-modern world, that their social recognition was primarily focused to their group's judgment of value and how they performed, and that's exactly what the Ajax story is meant to show. But Achilles, of course, is in one sense for us a very and this is why Nietzsche was very attracted to Achilles. Nietzsche has this little essay on Homer, because Achilles seems to be diametrically anti-modern, because Achilles is willing to sacrifice the community for himself, insofar that, when he gets the slave girl Briseis as his rightful property, and Agamemnon says, no, I'm the king, you give this, prize to me. And then Achilles, like maybe a teenager, sort of pouts off in his camp, in his tent, and says, look, I'm not going to help you guys because I'm going to sacrifice the community for me as an individual, and that is the heroic. And it's only, of course, when Patroclus dies that then he decides to engage himself, go back on the battlefield, etc. And I would say that that's a kind of anti-modern concept of the hero, because the hero is not the one who sacrifices himself for a greater good or for a community. The hero in Achilles is the one who sacrifices the community for himself. And therefore, his immortality, his great deeds, his identity, if you wish, is precisely not dependent or conditioned by social recognition and community. In fact, it's the opposite. He's willing to sacrifice the community for his own identity. I take that to be what Nietzsche thought is important about Homeric ethos, which is one where there is no possibility of resentment, of a ressentiment, because this is the morality of the strong, as he called it. And so that's how I would read Achilles in this very Nietzschean light, as opposed to Ajax, which is precisely succumbs to shame, succumbs to the dialectic of social recognition and identity that you then transpose. I think that part of the argument works for modernity, but this is to say maybe there's another kind of answer to modernity, and that's to be Achilles.
Yeah, sure. So I agree completely that Achilles is kind of, in a sense, a complete antithesis to modern identity formation. Still, it's an interesting question, of course, whether how we should think of Achilles' rage. Because it seems to me that Achilles, a bit like Ajax in the beginning of the Iliad, is of course humiliated. That's the reason for his fury, that Agamemnon and his people have kind of not given him his due, as it were. I'm taken away, however you pronounce her name in English, his slave. Sorry.
I think it's Briseis.
Briseis, yes, exactly. And again, you're right, of course, that he kind of sacrifices the whole group, the army, for the sake of his own glory. And this is and I think this is something that in the Homeric context is actually problematized. It's although it's not explicitly addressed, or it is explicitly in some of these exchanges, but it's definitely something that's also problematic from the perspective of the epic. So it's not something that's so to speak wholeheartedly appreciated, but this is exactly a kind of problematic side of Achilles, that he is ready to resort to this kind of egoistic search for glory. But again, I mean, I do think that if you read the Iliad, that there is a kind of tension in the epic between these two dimensions. That on the one hand, Achilles is really the one that then ultimately saves the Greeks, saves the army, saves the group, and gets his immortality. And on the other hand, his kind of vehement tendency towards egoistic search for glory. But yeah, I guess this is the topic of long further conversations.
Well, I'm glad that we got on to counterexamples and alternative models to the, I guess we would say, the ethics or politics of recognition. But I think we also have to take into account other kinds of lapses in the achievement of the ideal of one's self-image or projected self-image. And I mean, of course, there's a very easy move to make here, and we will be forced to make it at some point, which is to say, what is the nature of social forces that bring about the kinds of hierarchical and immanent pressures that form identities, namely things like capitalism and the fragments of more archaic social formations and so forth that are operative within modernity. But I want to go to something that you mentioned directly in the sketch that you sent to us. You had written something to the effect of, wherever we are in a social hierarchy, we feel pressure from above and below, and the constant draft of possible loss and status. And so there's a sense in which any of us who are striving to achieve a particular form of self-image are always going to feel the possibility of losing one step on that path, or losing one's gains that have been made, or losing a certain quantity or quality of social credit that we've accumulated in virtue of adopting or formulating some image of ourself. But I also imagine that there might be a strata in our society where people kind of hit a ceiling, or maybe they consciously give up on striving upwards. And instead, they build a kind of identity around that stopping point or the ruins of a project to achieve oneself. And that identity might function like a little refrain, kind of securing and validating the position that they've achieved, all the while insulating themselves from the anxiety of competition that would, be involved with getting back on the track to achieving a particular kind of social identity. So how would your model of identity on credit account for such cases where the self has stabilized itself against and is not any longer driven by the upward and downward pressures of the social ladder? Is that even a conceivable position in the framework that you're putting forward? Or is it the case that perhaps that on this sort of horizontal level, those pressures allow certain social codes to crystallize in a different way, maybe laterally, let's say?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, obviously you're right that there is that kind of phenomenon. I mean, but the question is, of course, what we are dealing with in different cases. I mean, the phenomenon of somebody at least seemingly being satisfied with living on a certain level in the hierarchy and not feeling that kind of upward pressure. So it's clear that we see that kind of thing. But I think that there are many existential possibilities here, which kind of produce this kind of, let's say, surface phenomenon. And I mean, one possibility, which I think is still available psychologically in modernity, is really the kind of thinking where you see people, high above you, soccer stars, movie stars, billionaires, etc., as somehow constituting something like a different species. They are simply a different kind of humans who are living their lives up there. This kind of life is not available to me. It's a natural order. This is really a kind of, let's say, pre-modern way of thinking, where you exactly kind of, let's say, naturalize the different strata in the hierarchy. So that's, of course, one way of doing it. I mean, it's full of self-deception, I would say, because obviously these people are not any different, but I mean, in any important sense. But of course, it's possible. I think this is something that we actually still encounter. Now, then there is a different, and that might bring you a certain peace of mind, of course. Well, I'm here living my life in this kind of social sphere, and I'm okay with it because actually nothing else is available. So you actually kind of in your psychology, you reproduce a kind of pre-modern setting, one could say. You kind of recreate it psychologically, although de facto, it doesn't really match with social realities anymore. But then there is another possibility. And we might always want to have a kind of depth interview with a person claiming to be satisfied and see whatever that actually means. And another possibility is, of course, that this is a position of ressentiment. That is to say, if you knock on the surface, you will find that this person actually feels a lot of hostility, hatred, resentment, contempt towards those people, or at least to select groups above. So, there are these millionaires, there are these bourgeoisie liberals, etc., etc. I don't want that kind of life because it's just crap, it's corrupt, it's this and that. And there you have a kind of classic, I would say, symptom of ressentiment, really, where what seems stable, I'm here living my humble life, actually has this kinds of it's kind of framed by an attitude of ressentiment.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a follow-up on that. This was, of course, a little bit of a setup. I agree with you. I think some of these accounts or narratives that, like you're saying, put themselves forward as being humble or modest or more rustic sometimes. Like, I live a rustic life, but sometimes that can also be a flight from the complex and cosmopolitan and things that are enlivening and things that challenge us. At the same time, there's another kind of lapse that I think maybe goes hand in hand with this, where if we have a particular self-image or notion of our own identity, one might argue in a kind of Deleuzian way that there are offshoots of our being, of our becoming, I should say, of our living, that don't easily slide into recognizable vectors. And sometimes these things come at us as a sort of surprise, or, we may have moments, encounters, events in our lives that rupture or shatter that self-image, but introduce to us something that might even be more enlivening than what we're already experiencing and outside of the frame of that which we have idealized. And so in that sense, there might be ruptures or kind of detours in the path to achieving one self-identity that might be marked by ressentiment, like we talked about earlier. But then there are these other things that happen, these forms of differencing that we might say, that at some point we might be called to affirm those differences, affirm those detours in a way that's at odds with the way that we imagined ourselves. How would that factor then into the notion of identity on credit? Is this a lapse in the creditor-debtor relationship in some sense? Is this then, pose the possibility of an identity that lies outside of the credit model?
I think that's, again, a complex question. It's interesting because whatever we are talking about here with identity, there are so many dimensions to identity that kind of have their own logic, one might say, which then might mingle in various ways. So also in this example, or this case where you mentioned the possibility of kind of encountering things, ruptures inside yourself, outside of self, that somehow draw you, let's say, or tempt you, or in another direction. I think this can mean very different things. So on the one hand, we can stay, as long as we stay within the logic of the drive for recognition, where the tempting quality, let's say, might be exactly again, ressentiment-driven, or maybe a possibility to somehow go from ressentiment to actualization. Let's say, well, perhaps I see a kind of something like a fantastic path open up to actually make my identity come true, or something like that. So you could account for those kinds of experience, I think, within the dynamics of recognition, where you have conformism, ressentiment, stabilization, all these possibilities. But then, of course, it's a wholly different matter as soon as you kind of bring in something like encounters with the world and maybe with forces in yourself that transcend this whole scheme, transcend the logic of recognition, one might say, and the economics of recognition, where you, for example, let's have, for example, experiences of love or encounters with people, with living beings, with whatever that might, in different ways, scatter your identity, bring in something that's actually not only threatens your identity, but also maybe, let's say, opens up something that has nothing to do with identity, I might want to say, something that the whole logic of identity doesn't really capture, me being this or that, as it were.
Yeah, well, I was curious. I mean, all of this discussion really focused on, you called it moral psychology, the individual. And I'm curious if whether the problem of resentment and the identity on credit, whether the grammar of that analysis, the grammar of your analysis changes if we look at it at the collective level. Because one could argue that this was both Nietzsche and Scheler, though they had competing accounts. For them, ressentiment was primarily a collective phenomenon. I mean, the Jews and the Christians for Nietzsche, bourgeois morality and democracy for Scheler. And though they had contrasting views, I mean, this is obviously Scheler's famous argument, they do argue that ressentiment is a problem of democracy. And it's a problem of democracy, not only for the identity on credit aspect, which I think you're developing well, but because democracy has as an ideal for all identities equality. So if you build in the notion as a kind of core value in your world, that all identities, regardless of whether you're black, blue, purple, you like this band, you like that band, that all identities are fundamentally equal in a political sense, then that breeds resentment. That breeds resentment because I will always recognize that de facto, one group of individuals with their identity are actually not equal to me because they have more wealth, they have more status, they have more whatever. So I'm curious, how does your analysis, do you see your analysis as another way to diagnose the almost insoluble tension between democracy and resentment? That there is no democracy without resentment. And that's why there will always be a volatility in a democratic society where one group will always, through its ressentiment, in a sense, attempt to overthrow that ideal of equality. And that was Scheler's argument, right? So that what drives ressentiment is equality, the ideal of equality as bound to the notion of identity at the collective level.
I think I'm very much agreeing with the kind of Schelerian analysis that you present. And in the sketch I sent you, I also quoted Scheler on this matter. I mean, when it comes to the relation between, an individual psychology and various collective social phenomena, I mean, one way of putting it would of course be to say that, well, when it comes to the whole issue of recognition and the dynamics of recognition, that's very much the kind of psychological mechanism, if we now take it from the individual point of view, that ties us to various social constellations. It's the kind of basic psychological bond that accounts for how various kinds of social constellations change our psychology, one might say. So it's really a kind of back and forth, I think. And I think that the question about present demand, about recognition, about social identities, about shame, I mean, all these questions will always kind of have their place somewhere in between individual psychology and various social constellations. I think it's an important point that Scheler makes about the potential of democracy to breed present demand. And one could go, I mean, these are of course connected, but in the book I'm writing, I'm also pointing to the very ideal of human dignity and of course the notion of the equal absolute value of all individuals, where that value is a value that every individual has, regardless of his or her social identity. So so the moment you get that kind of general moral outlook, where you think of yourself as having the same value and in some sense the same rights, that could be seen as kind of as following, or not following, but at least as possibly following from the idea of human dignity, then you will, of course, then in a certain sense, Pandora's box is opened up, because you are then also free and maybe forced to compare yourself with everybody else in society. And that will create new demands for defensive attitudes, because that will create a kind of new needs to defend yourself against the devastation of that kind of comparison, I think. So I think this is a kind of problem that's somehow, as you said, is something that's kind of deeply bound up with democracy.
And I take it that it's also bound up in a way that Scheler didn't as clearly perceive, that I would say in our world, identity is a commodity. It's a fully commodified. So there is no entity that's not a commodification. And that's exactly what we are constantly being sold, and we are constantly buying on credit in your analysis, that then it will bring us some sort of redemptive meaning to who we are based on this increasing circulation of identities, which are commodities. So I take it that then the way to break out of this unstable dialectic between, wanting to realize on credit this ideal self, always being bound to social recognition, and maybe this comes back to something that Craig had mentioned with his remark about Deleuze, is it possible to strive for an identity that is not a commodifiable identity? So is there an identity without credit? A kind of non-commodifiable identity, which wouldn't be an identity of the complete eccentric who just shuts themselves away, but nonetheless could be an identity in the public space. So it could be an identity that then requires recognition of some sort, but it's not an identity of consumption or commodification. Or is that just foreclosed just by the nature of the libidinal economy and commodification of identity, which is, if it was the logic of late capitalism, that there is no public identity, which by definition would not be a commodification of some sort, and therefore bound to this intolerable oscillation between ressentiment and wanting to break free from that, which only breeds more ressentiment.
My first reaction is that everything hinges on what we mean by identity. And I would maybe say that if by identity we mean a picture of ourselves that gets its emotional charge from our longing from recognition, if that's the charge of our identity, then I would say, if that's the main thing that we are concerned with, being this kind of person that has this kind of worthy appearance, being afraid of shame, longing for success, having all these kinds, an identity that lives in this kind of emotional milieu, one might say. If that's the case, I would say no. I would say, well, then our identity will be forever kind of tied to some kind of economics of recognition. But then again, there is, of course, the possibility, I think, of, well, maybe of course is too much, but I do think there is a possibility of transcending that logic. My own kind of understanding here is that especially a certain kind of love or openness to significance, to the world, to others, that transcends the need and the longing for them recognizing my social value, but rather we are talking about a kind of relation where I stretch out towards the other, longing for, let's say, encounters beyond identities or something like this. I realize that we would need to talk a lot more about this. I just want to point at this possibility. My point here is to say that, well, I do think that this is possible between humans, or possible for us as something that can happen between us and the world. But I wouldn't articulate this in terms of identity, because I wouldn't articulate this in terms of a certain kind of identity. Because I think as soon as I now have this identity as the loving person, for example, now I'm the loving person, the open person. I'm proud of being the open person. I'm proud of being, oh no, I'm ashamed. I wasn't the loving person who openly encountered my friend, etc., etc. I think as soon as we kind of start articulating these kinds of encounters between people that do not follow the logic of recognition in terms of identity, we kind of draw them back into that cognitive logic.
It's interesting because it reminds me of, Georg Simmel has this distinction between the drive for more life and the drive for more than life, he calls it. And this is in his Lebensanschauung book. And his sort of argument is that in a fully monetized capitalist society, where money has made all values equal insofar that everything is exchangeable for everything, then the self is driven by always wanting more life, more acquisitions. In a sense, it's a kind of anticipation of your identity on credit.
He's on the right track.
Yes, 100 years before you. But Scheler then has a similar kind of intuition that there's also this drive for what he calls more than life. And more than life is not more life. It's not more identity. It's not another identity. It's something other than something that fits within the identity of my life. Now, Simmel thinks that this is traditionally what religion was about. I mean, this for him is Christianity. But his problem is, look, we're not going back to Christianity because the gods are dead. So maybe I'll inflect that question. So, okay, this openness to the world, love, dignity, I mean, that is a kind of language of transcendence in Simmel's sense. It's more than life and not life. But is that a placeholder for something like religion? Or is it a placeholder for something else than religion? Right, because it also strikes me it's a very Nietzschean problem. Maybe the problem with modernity is that we don't have a robust sense of what religion functionally used to do for us.
Yeah. Now, of course, this is a tremendously important question, I think. And I'm, of course, well aware that the kind of vocabulary I'm using has religious sources mainly. I mean, that's for sure. But it's an interesting question that I'm still maybe struggling with to think about. I mean, I'm tempted to say, and I think I'm inclined to say, that the kind of transcending love or transcending, let's say, openness, maybe conscience also, that this kind of openness towards others, towards life, towards the world. I'm tempted to say that we don't need gods to articulate what is happening here. On the other hand, I mean, and this is something that I think I will be talking about in my book, when we had religious structures in place that to some extent articulated and gave us a language for this kind of transcendence. I think both the secular and the religious vocabulary have their own problems and possibilities, one might say. I mean, this is very simplifying, of course, because this is a huge topic. But one could say that in religious times, and I'm now mostly talking about Christianity and Judaism here as the paradigmatic example, we have a kind of religious vocabulary. We have the love of God. We have various kinds of promises of redemption, etc., kind of surrounding and framing something that is also an interhuman experience. And that's something that, in a certain sense, has the potential of kind of strengthening or giving a certain solidity to our understanding. It's as if we knew that this kind of thing exists in our lives. On the other hand, as soon as you bring in God and various ideas, for example, about afterlife, redemption, and so on, you also kind of risk corrupting the experience that you are articulating by bringing in maybe also kind of a economy of redemption, in various manners. On the other hand, as we move to the secular age, in a certain sense, some kind of possibility of thinking about love as such, one might call, opens up, but also becomes very difficult because our moral and psychological vocabulary, at least to this point in time, has great difficulties kind of capturing what we are talking about in the first place.
I think we've really landed on one of the most important issues connected to the libidinal economics as it pertains to resentment, which is there something else? And we've used the word transcendence. And if we have already foreclosed the possibility of returning to something like a monotheistic form of transcendence, then what is it we're looking for? An immanent form of transcendence of some kind. And I kind of want to smuggle in my view here, but in virtue of something that you did in the text that you gave us, I particularly like where you talk about ressentiment as a pharmacon, as being both a kind of remedy and a poison. And maybe just to back up a little bit more, I think one of the other questions that kind of keeps coming up in this conversation is whether or not we are condemned to a kind of gregariousness, if we are condemned to models of redemption that ultimately usher back in notions of identity. I think this is something that we find in Pierre Klossowski's reading of Nietzsche, in the sense that, do we attend to those deep, mute intensities, that there might be this other creative wellspring within the individual that is not bound up with the collective sphere. But the problem is always communication. Anytime that we attempt to communicate anything that occurs within that secret place within ourselves, well, then it enters back within the realm of morality. And I think this is important in terms of addressing the possibility of an immanent transcendence, because if we're talking about ressentiment as a pharmacon, and this is another thing that's in your essay here too, is I think failure as a particular kind of tragedy holds an important place in addressing what that form of immanent transcendence might look like. And I'll use an example to illustrate that. So let's imagine somebody who's tried to become a banker or somebody who's striving in the corporate realm. And often there's a particular image of power that is ascribed to that kind of person. Hey, this is the person who's made it. They've pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. They've come up with the original idea, but all of that is bound up within our very real material capitalistic economy. And it's often the case that what we see as new ideas, and this is kind of like what Nicholas was saying, is that every identity ultimately becomes a commodifiable idea. But that said, any of the models of achievement that we have, the corporate CEO, the prospective doctoral candidate in philosophy who's putting forward their thesis that's been rejected, all face the possibility of rejection, of failure. And insofar as they're able to meet the demands inside of a particular system or economy, they may feel as if they are participating in active forces in the sort of Nietzschean sense. But all the while, the forces of ethical and political recognition are composing the imminent pressures that are pushing them upward towards that ideal. So it raises the question if they are achieving a truly novel form of actualization, realization, enlightenment, whatever we want to call it. But failure is interesting in that when we fail, it poses us with a few possibilities. Two notable ones are completely succumbing to one's own bitterness, rejecting the system outright. I hate this whole system, and I'm going to do everything in my power to exact some form of revenge on it. But along the way, there might be new possibilities of buy-in, attempts at redemption of one's old identity, refurbishing an identity that did not achieve its self-image. So there is that. There is always a lure to go back into the creditor-debtor relationship of our modern capitalist economy. But there's also this other possibility where we acknowledge often the futile nature of our strivings, and also how the prospect of recognition might fall short of allowing us to achieve some sense of enlivenment or fulfillment. And if you read self-help literature, for example, somebody like Tony Robbins, who was popular in the 1990s in the United States, he used to make a distinction between, well, there is achievement and there's fulfillment. I can have X number of goals and I can achieve all of them, but never feel fulfilled. And I think when we achieve our self-image maximally, we might not feel a sense of enrichment, enlivenment, or fulfillment. But at the position of failure in any given instance, like I have not achieved my goal, I have not become the person that I set out to be, or I have not made progress on the track that I was pushed onto by my parents and my teachers and so forth. I think what happens at that point is it provides us with an opportunity to see an alternative and enact a transvaluation of values of some sort. Of course, that engenders all of the risks that we talked about. As soon as those values are articulated, it leaves to question whether or not they will be imported into the restricted economy of identity, if we want to call it that. But as I see it, there's also a sort of Deleuzean dimension to this too, where in Deleuze's reading of active and reactive forces in Nietzsche, he brings in the myth of Ariadne and Theseus, where he wants to say that the transvaluation of values can occur in a particular way, which is when negativity breaks with ressentiment and bad conscience. What does that mean? What does that look like? Well, one of the ways that it can be realized is as a rejection of the very forms, of the very schemes that produce resentment, that produce bad conscience, that produce a desire for recognition. And once we do that, it leaves open the possibility of this second affirmation, the affirmation of those differences, of those creative forces that return, that allow us to create something new. This can sound like a lot of philosophical hocus pocus, but I do think there is something very real there. I think there's a way that we can honor that lapse ethically when we fail to achieve certain goals or fall short of certain standards. One of the ways that we can react to that is by not reacting and using the potentially most reactive moment as a way to affirm active forces. And I'm curious if your notion of the pharmacon does something like that. That's the connection that I made, that there is a possibility there within the mode of utter resentment at the point of absolute failure, that we can convert that experience or convert the emotional tonality of that experience into something new.
Yeah, that was an interesting train of thought. And a lot of questions, again, that we would want to address if we still had a week of discussion.
It's a big bucket we gave you once again, right?
This is another big one. Now, and I think a lot of interesting things to discuss there. Let me say a few things. So first of all, I think that when it comes to whether success or failure, as it were, brings us closer to transcendence, for example? I mean, that kind of question. I think that's a very... I'm not sure whether we can say that any of those possibilities, any kind of position on that scale is kind of more fruitful, brings us closer to something that transcends this logic. So on the one hand, you could have the successful businessman, the banker, as it were. Well, something that success can bring is that you get a certain kind of self-esteem, maybe. A certain kind of, you think of yourself as, you look at yourself in the mirror, you think things are pretty good. I have the money, I have the position, I'm beautiful, blah, blah, blah. And that kind of position, I mean, you could have it in a more aristocratic or a more bourgeoisie mode, but it creates a certain freedom, perhaps for thinking about, it might allow you to take certain steps in certain directions because you are maybe not so afraid of messing up your self-esteem and your position. But usually I would say that, of course, if we know I think we are all completely clear about that it guarantees nothing, and usually it leads to nothing. I mean, to put it a bit cynically, you maybe you have the courage to take a few steps. I mean, you don't need much courage. That's the right way of putting it. To reading a bit, philosophical literature in some direction, or others that's maybe challenging your current ways of life, etc., etc. But you do it at a certain distance. You never travel into the deep waters. You stay within the kind of Bildungs paradigm where nothing really touches you. I mean, that's one possibility. And maybe you don't even do that. And then, of course, you have the kind of opposite where everything goes down the drain and you face complete failure. And then you have a different logic where, of course, as you yourself, as you mentioned, Craig, it's of course possible that kind of situation might get you even more tied up with the logic of recognition, because now you're kind of so close to shame and depression that you can think of nothing else. And you basically kind of find very little freedom to do anything kind of outside of that logic. But on the other hand, I do think, I also think that there is, of course, the possibility also, and I think this is an interesting theme where we have people like, where we can think of, I think, going down the path of destruction, as it were, or I mean, destruction is maybe not the right word, but kind of social failure. You kind of give up in a certain sense. You take to drinking, for example. You go down the drain. And like Dostoevsky's Underground Man, I mean, he's of course a man of ressentiment, but also the fact of when you kind of give up, I mean, that moment of giving up is of course also can be an experience of freedom, in the sense that, but of course it's so fraught with the kind of, I mean, ressentiment is, as it were, knocking on the door at that moment.
Wanted to just jump in. I know we're sort of approaching maybe a closing window of time, though, as you said, I mean, we could spend a lot of time discussing all of these things sort of on a different track. So identity without credit, I mean, have you thought about how so much of our society is living at the expense of the future? That's another way to understand this provocative statement. And here I'm thinking of, there's a wonderful short story by the American science fiction writer Ursula Le Guin called Omelas. And it's about a perfect society where everyone is fulfilling their desires. I mean, there's a land of plenty, abundance, but there's a room in which there's a kind of starving child that's being held. And this is obviously the image of the future, that, all of our, despite how all of the striving for recognition, identity, abundance, et cetera, there's another sense in which we're living on credit. And we're living on credit insofar that the material costs for precisely this kind of pursuit of the self, this product of the self, this product of modernity, is living on the credit of the future. Pollution, the litany of woes one can start unraveling. But I'm curious if you've thought about that other almost insinuation, the sort of other side to this very provocative statement of identity on credit, and that our whole existence is built on credit. At whose expense?
Yeah, that's a very accurate observation. I'm not sure. I think you are the one who has more to say about that theme, really. We have talked about it, and I find it incredibly interesting. And of course, I agree that that we are living on credit in that sense too, kind of pushing the catastrophe before us, as it were. Now, that also connects to a theme or topic of mine that I've been discussing, another kind of existential postponement that we haven't been discussing today, but that's really, it also has to do with economy, because I'm thinking about the Faustian myths and especially Marlowe's version, Dr. Faustus, where Dr. Faustus makes this bargain with the devil or with Lucifer, where I think that myth, that especially Marlowe's version, kind of gives expression to a kind of logical postponement. That's not exactly the identity on credit that I've been talking about, but it's a logical postponement where a certain contract-like structure allows us to postpone the questions of let's say, morality, goodness, redemption, evil, that I think is very typical of modernity. That is that we, and also the culture of youth, one might say, which is another interesting theme, that I think it's a very modern temptation and structure that we kind of are tempted to live in a kind of self-understanding where we, as it were, push the life that we are actually to live before us, a life that will redeem the life we are living now. I'm now allowing myself to pursue my career, to do this and that, to realize all these desires, and so on and so forth, because I tell myself later I will begin the serious moral life. There is that kind of postponement structure, I think, which is very usual. And by the way, it's a structure that also creates or makes death problematic in new ways in modernity. But I think this is a theme for maybe another session in the future.
Well, I want to thank both of you, Fredrik and Nicholas, for coming on the show today. This particular topic is of extreme interest to me, as you can tell. When can we expect either a paper or a book as a follow-up to our discussion today, Fredrik?
The honest answer is, I don't know. But, and of course, I don't make promises.
That's right. Only the man of ressentiment would make such promises.
Exactly. So let's not promise anything, but let's hope. I mean, that's a nice category, that it will materialize in a year or so.
Well, perhaps even hope is not the most ideal of expressions if we are thinking in a Nietzschean vein, but we hope to have you back on sometime in the future to resume this conversation. Thank you again both for coming on the show today.
Thank you both for an interesting conversation.
Thank you.